everyone, and welcome to the ESU Happy Hour. Today's presentation is The Eccentric Billionaire, John D. MacArthur, Rubies, Rascals, and Bears, Oh My, with Nancy Kriplen. My name is Elizabeth Bigelow, and I am the manager of branch services at the English-speaking Union of the United States. A big thank you to the Indianapolis branch, who is sponsoring today's Happy Hour. Ideas for our Happy Hour lectures come from you, our ESU members and viewers. At the end of this program, you will receive a survey where you can share your feedback on tonight's lecture, as well as any ideas for upcoming Happy Hour lectures. Before we get into the program, I wanted to note a few things about today's presentation. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the lecture. If you have a question, you can use the dedicated Q&A and chat modules that are at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Questions will be answered in the order they're received. Tonight, we have over 180 people registered for this event. I would like to give a shout out to the branches with the most registered members tonight. The branches are the Central Florida, New Orleans, and Atlanta branches. And to start us off today, I would like to introduce Mary Patricia Warnicki, President of the Indianapolis branch. Mary Patricia is the only Canadian-born member of the Indianapolis branch of the ESU, having been born in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and growing up in Sydney on Cape Breton Island. I will now turn it over to Mary Patricia to introduce tonight's speaker.
Hello, I am Mary Patricia Warnicki. For the past 2 years, president of the Indianapolis branch of the English-speaking Union. Our branch was founded in 1949. We are a rather small branch, but what we lack in size, we make up for in loyal participation and wonderfully stimulating programs. Just a few days ago, we had our annual meeting at the restored Jen Jensen Colonnade Garden at the James Allison Mansion, and then proceeded to the tea house where we celebrated the Queen's birthday. It was a most beautiful and enjoyable afternoon. By way of introduction to today's author, I will share part of her entry in ESU's 100 Years, 100 Stories project. It began when I was a teenager. I occasionally worked in my father's downtown law office. One morning, in walked two nice-looking young men. They were Englishmen touring the US, visiting English-speaking Union branches. This was the address of the Indianapolis branch, since my father was branch secretary. "Nancy," said my father, as he slipped me his charge card, "take these boys to lunch at Ayer's Tea Room, a popular restaurant at a department store a few blocks away." I can't remember what we talked about, and they were soon off to their next stop. But suddenly, ESU had become to me a much more interesting organization. Charles Lynn was president of the Indianapolis branch from its beginning in 1949 until 1958. After his death, his wife, Dorothy, became president. She frequently included my husband and me in the lovely dinner parties she hosted for visiting English speakers. Quite a change from our modest fare as newlyweds. When my husband was sent by Allison Division General Motors to England to work on a new engine with Rolls-Royce, he took me along and our 2-year-old toddler. My parents decided to enrich our experience with a membership in the British ESU. The closest ESU branch to our new hometown of Derby was in Nottingham. We found the branch's meetings to be stimulating, academic, and a bit more serious. Boxed cookies and instant coffee compared to the more social, elegant club luncheon meetings we were used to at the Indianapolis branch. We did make interesting friends and the meetings were well worth attending, even if the drive home from Nottingham sometimes involved such heavy fog that the passenger had to aid by her hand on the steering wheel while sticking her head out the window to see the edge of the road. Ah, fog, ah, England, ah, ESU. And now, here is Nancy and her daughter, Madelyn.
Thank you, Mary Patricia. That was lovely. We will get to the presentation in just a minute, but first I want to thank Karen Blair and the English Speaking Union for inviting me to talk about my book, a biography of John D. MacArthur, which is entitled The Eccentric Billionaire, and he was that indeed. Thanks also to Mary Patricia, whom you just heard. She's chairman of the Indianapolis ESU branch, to which my family belongs, and to my daughter, Madelyn Nasser, who will be joining us virtually from deepest, darkest Oregon. This is the book that we'll be talking about. And you'll recall the title of this presentation is Rubies, Rascals, and Bears, Oh My. Our first drama concerns the theft of a famous gem, a ruby. And so in the ESU happy hour tradition, here is our cocktail, a glass of ruby red port. Get it? Ruby. John MacArthur was controversial, hardworking, a super salesman, and in the end, rich, rich, rich. He hated lawyers, but was always suing someone. Here are a few of the words that were applied to him through the years. Incorrigible, bizarre, erratic, cunning, and yes, charming. Now let's get on with our story. We will talk first about the ruby. This was not just any ruby, but the DeLong star ruby. It was the size and color of a large, luscious grape with 6 perfect rays in the center, making what was called the star. It had been mined in the Far East in the country known then as Burma. A wealthy woman named DeLong had bought it, intending to donate it to the Museum of Natural History in New York City. In 1965, this spectacular stone was part of the Hall of Jewels stolen from New York's Museum of Natural History by a colorful, if incompetent, gang of thieves. John MacArthur got into the act by putting up the money, $25,000, to ransom the jewel that was left in a toll booth along the Florida Sunshine Parkway. MacArthur loved his role in the drama, casually flipping the gem in the air for reporters before letting local Florida residents see it. One woman was allowed to kiss it because it was her birthday. The gem was put safely in a local bank vault awaiting its return to New York City. Incidentally, these days, if you are in New York, you can see this famous ruby displayed in the American Museum of Natural History's Hall of Gems and Minerals. The ruby's return from Florida to the museum in New York was as dramatic as the rest of this adventure. A museum official with a black briefcase handcuffed to his wrist and accompanied by a private detective flew back to New York. He was greeted by a shouting mob of reporters. Meanwhile, another museum official, the actual ruby, in a plastic case under his shirt, quietly entered the museum through a back door. The ruby was safely home. Sometime later, the museum held a private thank you luncheon for John and his sister-in-law, the actress Helen Hayes, a patron of the museum. However, John had forgotten that he was being sued in New York by a disgruntled employee. A process server met him at the airport. Helen Hayes attended the luncheon without him. John Donald MacArthur was born in 1897, the youngest of the 6 MacArthur children. He was always a risk taker and competitive. Here is one example. The Wilson Academy was a church boarding school in Nyack, New York, that John and his older brother, Charlie MacArthur, attended. For some years, the school had offered a prize to the student who could swim across the Hudson River, which was 3 miles across at its widest point. In the summer of 1914, 17-year-old John MacArthur plunged into the river, and 2 hours later, carried downstream by the tide, climbed out at Dobbs Ferry on the opposite side. The coveted Wilson letter W was his. John's brother, Charlie MacArthur, would grow up to be a successful playwright and marry actress Helen Hayes. How did they meet? Here's the story. Charlie approached the pretty young actress at a Manhattan party, and here was a nice touch. George Gershwin was at the piano. So this young girl was sitting quietly in the corner, sipping ginger ale. Charlie, so the story goes, dumped some peanuts into her hand. "I wish they were emeralds," he said. Isn't that a great pickup line? We can all imagine the dialogue many years later when Charlie brought home from World War II service in India, yes, a bag of emeralds. But back to World War I, John MacArthur saw military service in Canada's Royal Flying Corps. This was after being bounced from the US Navy for bizarre conduct. The Royal Flying Corps was much more to his style, and in his uniform, he cut a dashing figure indeed. "You are like a knight of old," John told Charles, his brother. "You go out by yourself and nobody can tell you what to do." And that was always important to John MacArthur. Alfred MacArthur was the eldest of this talented brood of MacArthur children. Now, Alfred was a stickler for the truth and playing it straight. John MacArthur worked for him briefly when he was learning the insurance business. That did not last long. Said John, who all his life had trouble taking orders from anyone, "I can work with you, but not for you." Alfred had a bright, attractive, teenage employee named Catherine Hyland. A petite brunette, she caught John's eye, even though by now he was already married and had 2 children. She joined him in his new insurance business. John, a natural salesman, was desperately working from dawn to dusk, selling insurance. Catherine, who was a quick study, was at his side. The two of them, Catherine and John, pooled their assets. The stock market crash of 1929 was on the horizon. In early 1930, John renamed their floundering collection of little insurance companies Marquette Life Insurance Company. Then John briefly rented office space on the 13th floor of Chicago's elegant Marquette office building, which had an interesting historical frieze in the lobby. The building's lobby was also decorated with mosaics, and they all honored the 17th century priest explorer, Father Marquette. And if the public thought that the Marquette office company owned the Marquette building, well, so be it. Nearly half a century later, when John's insurance and real estate fortune had made him a billionaire, John did buy the Marquette building. It is now designated a National Historic Landmark. But back to our story. When the Marquette rent got too expensive, John moved his headquarters to Chicago's West Side. Eventually, these offices were an odd collection of neighborhood buildings, all hooked together. Empty flower shops, empty taverns, and small restaurants. And they were all haphazardly hooked together. Remember, this was in the middle of the Great Depression. Some areas had very low ceilings, so John hired dwarfs to collect the trash in those areas each night. They might not be singing hi-ho, but John won a citation for hiring the handicapped. Employees learned not to trip over seeing eye dogs and to use sign language to communicate with deaf workers. However, John wanted to make sure that nobody thought he was getting soft. If they weren't doing their jobs, I would fire them, he said. In 1935, John had a chance to buy a failing insurance company called Bankers Life and Casualty at a fire sale price. He was told it had potential, but was being poorly managed. This company was the elephant on which he and Catherine would eventually ride to spectacular success. Each morning, the day's mail would be sorted into two piles, one for incoming payments, the other pile, which went into the wastebasket, for claims. Heck, said John, people with legitimate claims will contact us again. One day, the Illinois State Insurance investigator showed up at John's office with a list of some of those unpaid claims. I am staying right here and taking those checks to mail myself, said the investigator. John walked over to Catherine's desk with the list and told her to write the first check and address the envelope. But he carefully moved his finger down to the next address so that each claim check went to the wrong address. The insurance investigator was on the other side of the room and could not see any of this. By the time claimants had returned the checks and received replacements, John and Catherine had cobbled together the necessary money. Only one claimant tried to cash the first check, and John sued him. John would sell insurance policies for whatever money a person had in his pocket. Even those who had nothing else good to say about John MacArthur admitted he was a terrific salesman. Many years later, some young salesmen came to him for advice. Don't talk about death, he told them. Talk about taking care of your family. Talk about their kids' education. At one point, John decided to try selling policies by mail. He invested in a slick, expensive sales brochure, but it was a failure. He went back to the more homespun looking brochure, and this brought in customers. These and other unorthodox sales methods horrified more traditional insurance companies. Many years later, Bankers Life had a West Side Chicago office staff of about 2,000 employees and more than $100 million in premium income. Journalist Stuart Alsop would later write, once you are rich, spelled R-I-C-H, you can make a great deal of money with very little risk, spelled R-I-S-K. But to become rich in the first place, it is necessarily not only to have a good idea, but also to go for broke to prove that your idea will work. And that was exactly the game plan that John MacArthur followed. Through the years, there had been rough spots in John and Catherine's relationship. John always had an eye for the girls. Finally, Catherine had had enough. She left John and moved in with her sister. The divorce legal proceedings went on and on and on. Finally, the judge, feeling that there were too many lawyers and too much money involved, suggested that John and Catherine go away together for a couple of weeks and just work things out. John said later he would always be grateful to that wonderful quote unquote judge for making sure that he and Catherine stayed together. And here, of course, they are. Now the action in this John MacArthur saga moves south to Florida. Here's a map of Florida, which you all recognize. Singer Island and Palm Beach Gardens are labeled. In 1955, John foreclosed on a loan made on several thousand acres of land on Florida's east coast. That's the Atlantic coast. Riviera Beach was one of the little towns along this stretch of sand dunes, sea oats, and palm trees, jutting out into the ocean north of Palm Beach. And this is on the Atlantic side, remember. In 1963, John bought the Colonnades Beach Hotel at the south end of Singer Island. This slightly down at the heels hotel gave John the main stage on which he would live out the rest of his life. He was well on his way to becoming the largest individual private landowner in Florida. Later, one of John's best-known developments would be Palm Beach Gardens. In our time, it has been famous for being home to, among others, the tennis sisters, Venus and Serena Williams. The front cover of my biography, The Eccentric Billionaire, shows John wearing his green MacArthur plaid jacket, seated at a small table in the Colonnades Hotel coffee shop. It was his preferred place to do business, to make loans, scoop up more real estate, and check on the insurance business up in Chicago. Sometimes he got to work at 5 or 5:30 in the morning. But back to the coffee shop. When he got restless or bored, he could just pick up his papers and cigarettes and leave. But sometimes he poured his unfinished coffee back into the restaurant's big coffee urn. Yuck! Did I mention that he was a cheapskate? Of course, he would not be able to just pick up and leave if he were doing business with someone in a proper office upstairs. John increasingly seemed to enjoy having an audience for his shenanigans and to hang out with celebrities. He even built a special suite for comedian Bob Hope, and once, as a gag, showed up in a waiter's white jacket to pour coffee for Hope. A cigarette was dangling out of his mouth. All was duly recorded by a photographer, of course. Some transactions, however, did require more privacy. John's lawyer, Bill Kirby from Chicago, had warned him that his fortune was a disaster from a tax point of view. John and Catherine were in the office upstairs when lawyer Kirby presented plans for a foundation that would protect the estate, and John looked over the papers. Put her name in there too, said John, referring to Catherine. She helped build it up. Catherine, at the typewriter, made an erasure and typed in, quote, John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. In my opinion, this was probably John's finest hour. John seemed to have come to terms with having others, like foundation trustees, make decisions about his money. He told a reporter, I've seen too many people, including Henry Ford, try to administer their estate from the grave. But times change. Besides, you lay down rules and people don't follow them. I'll trust to the Almighty that my trustees will do more good for the country than I would. In future years, one of the most famous uses of this money would be the so-called MacArthur Genius Awards. Officially, it is known as the MacArthur Fellows Program. John's son, Roderick MacArthur, and lawyer Bill Kirby would share credit for bringing to the foundation a suggestion in a medical journal that they had seen, and it suggested that innovative people sometimes just need time to think. Albert Einstein could not have written a grant application saying he was going to discover the theory of relativity, Bill Kirby and Rod MacArthur explained. This so-called Genius Award caught the public's fancy. These days, people win a MacArthur just like they win a Guggenheim, a Pulitzer, or a Fulbright. It has become shorthand for achievement. But we have gotten way ahead of our John MacArthur story. In the 1960s and 1970s, John's health continued to decline. His public appearances were increasingly bizarre, and hospital stays were more frequent. He had advanced pancreatic cancer, and so eventually did his son, Roderick. After John watched friends like David Sarnoff suffer through long final years, John requested that he himself die, quote, pain-free and with dignity. John MacArthur died shortly after midnight on Friday, January 6, 1978. He was 82 years old. At the time of his death, he was probably the second richest man in America after shipping tycoon Daniel Ludwig. The next morning, the flag at the Colonnades Beach Hotel was lowered to half-staff. However, in Chicago, employees at Bankers Life were told that their leader had died, but that there would not be a day off in his memory. Said a voice over a loudspeaker, in accordance with Mr. MacArthur's wishes, it will be business as usual. Thank you for listening, and now we will have some questions which Madelyn will help me with, my daughter.
All right, finally, my chance to ask some questions. Let's start with, can you confirm that I am your favorite child? Or should we wait maybe until something like Christmas? This may be the wrong time. We'll wait till the family is all together and then you can answer.
Okay.
Maybe more on topic. I think one of the questions that is maybe top of mind for a lot of people is when you hear about the kind of businessman and potentially unsavory practices employed by John MacArthur, and then you contrast that with the kind of work that his foundation is doing, how should we reconcile that for ourselves?
That's a very interesting question, and it's something I've thought a bit about. But here is an example of something that happens that I think puts this in a different light, perhaps. All through the years, on John's birthday in March, a group of his friends would get together and celebrate his life. And you think, well, was this happening to other wealthy people? I don't know that it was. He was apparently very good company. And so I decided one time to go down and see if I could talk my way into this celebration. So I showed up at where I knew they were meeting to commemorate John MacArthur. And I said, okay, I would like to come in and just observe from the back of the room. Would that be possible? And they said, no way. They said they didn't trust the media, which I represented, and they did not want anybody else in watching what was going on. And I said, oh, please, I'll be very quiet and I'll just sit in the corner. Won't you let me come in? And they said, no. So my trip down there was not as productive as far as I was concerned about getting in on some of the celebrations. But I do think it's remarkable that somebody like John MacArthur, he must have been really good company. I never met him, of course, and but he must have been good company because his friends hung in there. And of course, there were fewer of them every year. They started dying off, but they enjoyed meeting John MacArthur once a year.
I ran across this photo. I'm going to put it up on the screen during the preparation for this talk today when I was trying to learn a little bit more about John. And I'm wondering if you could tell us what is happening in this picture.
Oh, well, that's John and his sister-in-law, Helen Hayes. And look at that big smile. She's, of course, a very good actress. And they were on the way. And as you can see, he's wearing his MacArthur plaid jacket. But they went together to a big fancy event at the White House when Jerry Ford was president. And they had to get all dressed up. It was white tie, the invitation said. And Helen Hayes said, John, we cannot arrive at the White House in a taxi. We must rent a limousine. And so they did. But it took years and years and years before Helen could get John to pay his share of the cost of the evening, the rental of the clothes and the rental of a limousine. Very typical.
What about his final resting place? It seemed like he had close ties with both Chicago and Florida. Where was he eventually buried?
Well, that's interesting. He was cremated and a plane went out over the Gulf Stream off of Florida and scattered his ashes in the ocean. How about that?
That's dramatic. It sounds
It
like
is dramatic, right?
I want to switch and ask a question about the writing of the book, less about John MacArthur, which is, you've written some other biographies, two of them about kind of exemplary men with very principled and known for that, Dwight Davis, Irwin Miller, and then you've thrown John MacArthur in here. What were some of the reasons that his story felt to you like one you wanted to tell?
I read a letter or a brief article in the New York Times from a young man who was down in Palm Beach visiting his parents. Well, he had heard about John MacArthur and his coffee shop. So he drove up there and sat at a table and watched him. And that's where I got the item about him pouring his coffee back into the communal coffee urn. And I thought, that sounds like an interesting person. I'd like to know more about him. So I started to do, as you do when you're writing a biography, I looked at what had already been done and I thought, I think there's room for another book in there. And so I started doing the research, and it was, with somebody like John, I was in Gainesville doing some work at in the archives of what's in Gainesville, University of Florida, right? And I thought, this is an interesting book, but I was paying for the research myself. And I was staying at sort of a sleazy motel. And that night there were loud parties, so I shoved the dresser against the front door. And I thought, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? And then when I woke up in the morning, I was safe. Nobody came crashing into my room. I thought, yes, but he certainly is interesting. I think I'll get on with this. And so that was one of the many times that I was a little bit wishy-washy about whether I really wanted to finish writing this book, but he was such an interesting character that I decided, yes, it was worth it.
You and I have had this discussion a little bit over the years, but I think it would be interesting to hear again your perspective on whether we or how can we think about judging historical figures by the kind of the moral standards that we generally have today. How do you apply our current kind of character standards to past figures?
You know, that is a very interesting question, because it seems to me as our life and our social culture has gotten much more complicated recently, and more awful things are happening. John doesn't seem so bad to me. I'm thinking, you know, he could be a trickster, but he was certainly an interesting person, and he wasn't. And when you compare him also with people like Carnegie, and Pulliam, some of the other people who had really disgraceful, John D. Rockefeller, for instance, who had to pretty up his image because of riots and bad things that had happened during his lifetime. So, you know, I think in a way, John has seemed more and more mainstream and less a character, and worth commenting on, worth shunning as our current culture gets more, what can I call it? It's, you know, we're having hackers, we're having all sorts of bad things. You know, John wasn't all that bad. And obviously his friends who met once a year to talk about him felt that way also. Of course, there was a smaller and smaller number every year because they all were reaching the end of their lives. But I think you have to look at John and what he did, and what he what we thought of were the critical things that he did in light of our society today, which is sometimes not all that admirable.
I have one last question before we can open up to the broader group, because it looks like there's some coming in about the foundation. And I was wondering if you knew how much the DeLong Star Ruby was worth today, and if you knew if it was well guarded. And I'm asking for a friend.
Pretty mysterious. I think it's probably very well guarded, and I think that it's pretty safe in the American Museum, and I think it's. I have no idea what it would be worth today, and I don't think anybody could put a dollar value on it. That's just my interpretation, and I think anybody who wants to go see it knows where it is, and it's safe in the New York. And you know, that museum looks sort of like a fortress anyway. So I think it's very safe there.
My chances aren't too good. My friend's chances aren't too good.
Yes, right.
I think, Beth, we're ready to open it up to the audience.
All right, wonderful. Thank you both so much, Nancy and Madelyn. I'm going to go ahead and start off with some questions. Just as a reminder to all of our viewers, if you have a question you would like to ask, feel free to use the Q&A and chat modules at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The questions will be answered in the order that they are received, and we'll go ahead and start. So our first question is from Ovid Vitas. She's with the Central Florida branch. The question is, what are the main objectives of the MacArthur Foundation?
I wish I had their motto right here. They are mainly interested in the action of, darn, I wish I had that. They are mainly interested in having us a green community and green emphasis in our society. And they also are anxious to support other things in society that are worth supporting. And of course, they have the money that will do it. And that's a very admirable goal on their part.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Our next question is from Jeff Schnabel. He's with the Kansas City branch. He writes, anyone who watches public television or listens to National Public Radio recognizes the names John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur as generous donors. Is there a backstory about his strong interest in public media?
Well, it would be nice to think that that was the case. I think he was much more interested in letting Catherine share in the credit for this fortune that he had amassed, because I think he maybe did not necessarily know yet about, he died in 78. So I'm not sure how much time he actually spent watching public television, but I think the goals of the stations now are very much the goals that he would agree with for his money. And so that's, I think, a very interesting connection, his money and the goals of public television.
Mom, do you remember that quote that you used to talk about in connection with his funding the foundation with his money from his business? I think it was Professor Taylor. Is that right? Do you remember that?
Oh, yes,
about
that's
penny?
right. And I used that as the epigraph in the front of the book. And this quote was, and I thought it was just great, because you are sitting on sort of a balance beam when you look at the way John operated and what he did with his money. And the quote was, you should not judge a penny by its pedigree, but by its future. And I think that's a very good way to look at what we do with the money from many of these big fortunes.
Okay, wonderful. All right, we have time for a couple more questions. So this next question comes from Jim Fadley. He's with the Indianapolis branch. His questions are, how large was MacArthur's estate? And what are the assets of his foundation?
Hi, Jim. Nice of you to tune in. Let's see. I think the foundation assumed his assets after John died, and there were at least $1 billion in and they were, of course, getting more money all the time, as that one comment was, that once you've got money, it just grows and grows and grows. 1978, the foundation has made grants totaling more than $6.8 billion in the US and 40 countries around the world. And I think that, again, I liked the professor, I think his name was Graham Taylor, who said that what counts is not a pedigree of a penny, but its destiny.
That's a lovely quote. Thank you. Okay, and then our last question comes from Kate Duffy, who says, as you and Madelyn already know, I am your true favorite child. But my question for you today is, what was your most memorable interview for this book?
Kate Duffy is my other daughter, so you're getting into a little daughter one-upmanship here.
Christmas, Kate, at Christmas, we'll iron this whole thing out.
Yes. Well, I think, wait a minute, what was the question? What was my favorite interview person?
Correct. What was your most memorable interview for this book?
I think probably, well, yes, and this will be a surprise. I talked to people at the MacArthur Foundation up in Chicago. They're in a new building, but they moved the old doors and some of the old traditions. And I was telling this one young woman about how they would not pay some of the claims, and she was horrified. She said, I am so scared every day. I sit here and I'm afraid one of my claims is going to fall off my desk onto the floor and I would be fired immediately. I thought, what a change.
Okay, fantastic. And with that, that concludes our question and answer session. Thank you so much to both you, Nancy, and you, Madelyn. I'm going to now turn it over to the chair of the ESU Happy Hour Committee, Dr. Karen Blair Brand, to close us out for this evening.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the happy hour today. I would like to give special thanks to Nancy Kriplen and her daughter, Madelyn Kriplen Nasser, for their time and talent in detailing the life of John D. MacArthur. I would also like to thank the Indianapolis branch for hosting this happy hour, and branch president Mary Patricia Warnicki for introducing tonight's speakers. The English Speaking Union is a membership organization, and if you are not a member, I encourage you to become a member. It's a wonderful organization. We do so many different things. There will be more information on membership available to you in the survey after tonight's program. This happy hour lecture series is completely curated by ESU branch members. And our next and final happy hour for this series will be on Wednesday, June 29th. And for this ESU member sharing of your favorite sonnets, verses, poems, and prose event, we seek your submissions to be analyzed by Dr. Robin Sinclair, a longtime member of the ESU from the Nashville branch. You may be asked to read your submission during the ESU happy hour on June 29th, and if so, you will be invited to participate in a rehearsal prior to Wednesday, June 29th. Thank you again, everyone, and have a good evening.